When you open the New Testament for the first time, you are opening a treasure. What I mean by that is that in this book that we have at the end of our Bible, this book that represents Gospels and letters, the book of Revelation, what we have is the great record of the things we believe in the church. It is a treasure indeed, but it is also an ancient treasure. And what I mean by that is this. The things that we have here inside of the New Testament come from an ancient world. It is a story that is precious to us. It is a story that comes from an ancient culture. It is a story from another land, very far away. It is a story that comes from 2,000 years ago. And so therefore, as we open this treasure and we begin to interpret and understand what is inside this treasure box, we are going to need some help. This is a story that comes from antiquity. It has a timeless message, but the story itself isn't timeless. Like any good story, it is wrapped in the clothing of a culture from antiquity. So you and I are going to have some coaching as we read some of the stories here inside of this book. The New Testament, of course, has 27 books. It is written in Greek. We have 4 Gospels that center on the life of Jesus. We have a book called the Book of Acts, which tells us how this fledgling group of apostles moved from their discipleship with Jesus into the growth of the early church. And then we have a whole list of letters, 21 letters inside of the New Testament, written by people like Paul and Peter and John and James and so forth. And then lastly, we have the book of Revelation that profiles what the end of time is going to look like. When we read the New Testament, it is embedded inside of a historical period, of course, and that historical period that we have to be acquainted with runs from roughly 300 BC until about AD 150. The New Testament itself concentrates on events which take place from roughly the first half of the first century. But like any period of time in history, it is going to be affected by events that are swirling around it centuries before and even some time after. Now, in order for us to be interpreters, good interpreters of the New Testament, there are some tasks which have to be a part of our job. We call this contextual interpretation. What it means is that we want to reconstruct the context of the New Testament as effectively as we can, so that when the stories that we read are laid into that context, suddenly the stories make sense. Let me give you some examples. When I think about bread manufacture, I think I understand that in the 21st century. I'm not sure, frankly, because I just go to a grocery store. But they didn't have grocery stores in the first century. And so therefore, when someone in the New Testament begins to work an analogy about bread or yeast, if I don't know anything about the ancient process of bread manufacture, it'll be impossible for me to understand what that analogy means. When it comes to collecting water and storing water and valuing the quality of water, well, in the 21st century, I don't even think about things like that. I just turn on the tap and I figure my city is going to make sure that this water is clean. But in the ancient world, they classified water in a variety of ways. Some of those ways were religious. Some of those had to do with hygiene, some with purity. So therefore, if I have a discussion in the New Testament about living water, if I don't understand that code language, and there's an important word, code language, if I don't understand the codes, the culture codes that are at work inside of the New Testament from 2,000 years ago, it'll be impossible for me to understand what's going on. Let's take fishing as another example. The Gospels tell a story about when Jesus is on the shore at the Sea of Galilee, and his followers have a frustrating night and early morning trying to fish. And then he tells them to just toss a certain kind of net off the edge of the boat, and they have this miraculous catch. Now, we need to know something about how ridiculous that command was. We have to have some idea how they fished 2,000 years ago on the Sea of Galilee, and we know all of these things. What I mean is that these are codes which unlock cultural reflexes which are in the ancient world. And if we have those codes down, we'll do well. Now, there are 3 assignments that most New Testament interpreters want to have in their back pocket whenever they open the New Testament. These are the three areas, categories, that you and I will want to make sure that we master. Let me give them to you one at a time. First of all, we need to know the land. Where did this story take place? You know, whenever you tell a story, it presumes that there is a geographical location and there's a story that comes with that geographical location. If you happen to be American, you would know something, for instance, about the Civil War that took place over about 150 years ago. But if you don't know anything about the geography of America, about the South and the North, it would be impossible to understand anything about that. If you were studying the United Kingdom, for instance, and you didn't know anything about the differences between, say, Scotland and Wales and Ireland and their frustrations with their English domination in past centuries, it would be impossible to understand some of their stories. So every story is embedded in a geographical sort of plain board, and you and I need to have some sense of that. So when I open the New Testament and I hear references to Judea, I have to have an idea that Judea is in the south of the country and Jerusalem anchors Judea. If I hear a reference to Galilee and I don't understand where Galilee is, I'll be at a loss. I need to know, as everybody did in the stories, that Nazareth is in Galilee, Lower Galilee it's called, Capernaum is in Galilee, and it's anchored by the Sea of Galilee. So all of these things geographically really do help us to interpret things. Let me give you an example of one way that this interpretation is interesting. Jesus is from Western Galilee. Now, that may not mean a great deal to you now, but that means simply that he is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, the culture is prominently Jewish, and it is run by a son of Herod the Great named Herod Antipas. And this Herod Antipas did not like Jesus, and especially did not like John the Baptist. In fact, he killed John the Baptist. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that Jesus is always under threat by the followers of Herod Antipas, because in some ways he poses a challenge to Herod Antipas. So here's what's interesting. There's a border between Western Galilee and Eastern Galilee, and the two have separate rulers. The one in the east is more Hellenistic, and he's more tolerant. And so therefore, when things heat up in Western Galilee, notice carefully how Jesus moves from the west to the east. And when he moves across the Jordan River on the north tip of the Sea of Galilee, he's actually moving provinces. And what that does is that takes him out of jeopardy, away from the reach of Herod Antipas. So therefore, when we hear these stories and we understand what their geography is, when we know the land, suddenly the story pops. It makes sense to us. When I read the stories about Paul and understand that he is moving up across this huge landmass that today we call Turkey, but scholars call it Anatolia or Asia Minor. When Paul is moving across these areas, he's moving through geographical areas that everybody in the ancient world would have recognized. Cappadocia, Galatia, Asia, Bithynia. These are places that everyone knew, Paul knew intimately. And when he crosses the Aegean Sea and ends up in Macedonia and down in Achaia, he is in areas that are foreign to us, but intimately known to the Apostle Paul. So the first point is, if we're going to study the New Testament, we need to know the landscape that birthed this story. And if we don't know the landscape, it will be almost impossible for us to understand the nuances in the story. Listen to this description. It's in Acts 13, verse 13, but listen to all the geographical references. You don't need to know where they're from, but notice how they're presupposing geography. Paul and his company set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. But they passed on from Perga and came to Antioch in Pisidia, and on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. Now, you and I, living in the 21st century, are going to have an impossible time understanding that paragraph. But if we have a sense of the geography of the ancient world and the map on which Paul's life is being lived, suddenly all of those place names make sense. All right, so the first thing that you and I need to do is master the geography of the land. Second thing, our second task to do contextual interpretation is that we need to master the history that has been taking place on this land for a certain number of centuries. Now, I said we should reach back to about 300 BC, and we reach forward to about AD 150. This is what I mean here. We need to know when these stories happened and what other stories are swirling around them. I reach back to 300 BC because I want to make sure that I understand what it meant when, for instance, Alexander the Great entered the Eastern Mediterranean. How did he change the culture of this entire world? And he changed it remarkably. If you ever travel to any ancient city, say from North Africa all the way up through Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Syria, Jordan, it doesn't matter. Go to Iraq, go to Syria. You will see structures from 2,000 years ago that came from this period. When we look at manuscripts that are written in Greek, how did that happen? That a world that never was using Greek, that was only using Semitic languages, suddenly begins to speak Greek. This begins with Alexander the Great. So I reach back to 300 or so BC, and I know that Alexander entered the scene, and I've got to realize that the Greeks were really controlling this entire part of the world until there was this enormous revolt that was generated by Jews and other provinces to get the Greeks out of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Jews were successful, and they had their own autonomy for about 100 years. They weren't very good at their self-rule. In fact, they began to fight with each other, and that's another story. But then we need to know in 63 BC, a guy named Pompey, a Roman general, conquers this entire Eastern Mediterranean in the name of Rome. So here I have got a Greek Hellenistic period. We call it Hellenistic. The Greek word for Greek is Hellene. So it is the Hellenistic period. I've got this Jewish autonomy, and I've got Roman conquest and occupation. And the New Testament is birthed in this era of Roman occupation. So when I'm reading my New Testament, it's really clear that the Romans are in charge. It's very clear that the Jews see this occupation as oppressive. And for 100 years before the time of Jesus and during the time of Jesus, the talk in the dark alleyways of Jerusalem was about revolt. How is it that we can throw out the Romans just as our ancestors threw out the Greeks? Political conspiracies are running rampant through the period in which the Gospels are written. And if I don't know that there are these kinds of political controversies going on, I'll miss a lot of what's happening inside of the New Testament. An example, there is a person who comes up to Jesus and asks him a very simple question. You and I think it's simple, but it isn't. Master, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, you would think in the 21st century that that is a question about taxation and what we call the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service that collects national taxes. It's not that. You see, in about AD 6, there was a Jewish revolt that understood that the only reason the Romans wanted to control these provinces was for the revenue that they could take out of them. So therefore, there was a movement to resist the paying of taxes to Rome and thereby make this province so problematic the Romans would begin to let go of it. Taxation and the control of taxation was on everyone's mind. When there's a revolt, the first thing the peasants do in this province 2,000 years ago is they go immediately to the main public building and they burn the tax archives. Everybody wants to burn the tax archives because if all records of property are missing, then you really cannot tax anybody. So when someone asks Jesus, Master, should we pay taxes or not? Let's reframe the question. Jesus, are you sympathetic with the tax revolt being generated here in our generation? Now, of course, Jesus answers by saying, and holding up a coin, whose image is on this coin? And he says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Now let's decode that. Jesus is actually saying, gentlemen, I understand exactly what you're asking. I understand that there is a political revolt based on taxation inside of our country, but my kingdom has no such political ambitions. Thank you very much, but I am not interested in what you want of me. So if I don't understand Roman occupation and political control, I'm going to have a difficult time understanding a lot of these coded messages which are inside of the New Testament. All right, so number one, we want to know, where did this story take place? What is the land? Secondly, I need to know something about the history all around this story. And then one last item that you and I need, and that is to understand the culture. Every society, every story presumes that its listeners, the listener to a story, has a shared cultural assumptions. You and I, just as we talk together in the 21st century, we are going to have to use a shared vocabulary. We're going to have shared metaphors. We have assumptions that we use whenever we speak. So like when somebody says to me, "Did you read what's online today?" Imagine what that sentence would mean to someone who doesn't know anything about the internet. What does online mean? It's a meaningless word, but today it has taken on new significance. So that means that the message of the New Testament, the message of Paul's letters, the message of the Gospels is embedded in a culture. The story is locked into a land, a history, and a culture, and I have to have some idea how these culture codes are working. If I don't know the culture codes, then I can't really understand what the people are saying. It's almost as if the story of the New Testament is a song being played out perhaps on a piano, or better still, on a drum. You know, the Eastern Mediterranean cultures today, the Arab cultures, use drumming regularly. I've been in situations where they've tried to teach me drumming patterns. I like drumming. But if you have not been born into a culture that understands the complex patterns of drum rhythms, you will not be able to recognize the songs being sung in that society. So it's the very same thing in Jesus' day and in Paul's day. There are cultural assumptions inside of the story. Here's an example. There is a time in which Jesus goes to a dinner party. The host is a man named Simon. He's a Pharisee. It says actually in the story that they are reclining at table, and you and I would need to know immediately, what do you mean recline at table? Don't they sit in chairs like we do? No, they don't. They recline, and they recline on their left elbow because they're reaching into the common bowls with their right hand, which is the only hand that's appropriate to do that with. These are all culture codes. And when you come to that meal, you're welcomed by the host. Everyone knows this. Your feet get washed. You get kissed as a greeting. You get scented olive oil to place on your head. It's kind of a nice gesture. I'm not a fan, but nevertheless, it's 2,000 years ago. And so Jesus comes to such a dinner party, and he finds himself reclining at the meal. But we learn in the story that Simon the Pharisee has given him none of the common cultural gestures of greeting. None of them. It's an offense. Simon has actually publicly shamed Jesus and invited him to this sophisticated dinner party in order simply to show him that he's an outsider. A woman who sees this entire thing, who loves Jesus, who has had some contact with Jesus in the past, breaks into the room, moves around the perimeter of this dining setup. Jesus' feet are extended behind him. I need to understand what that means and how he's reclining. She rushes to him, grabs onto his feet, weeps and wets them, lets down her hair, anoints him, and then dries his feet with her hair. It's an incredible scene. And if you know anything about the cultural boundaries between male and female inside of this culture 2,000 years ago, you would understand why Simon is outraged by what he sees. Then when I see Jesus turn his back away from the dinner party and address Simon the host by graciously affirming this woman, you can see how Jesus very artfully has declared his own counterattack. That entire story is shaped by the cultural implications, assumptions, codes, which were alive and well in Jesus' first century culture. So if we don't know the land, if we don't know the history, if we don't know the geography, we're not going to really get the true depths of the story of the New Testament. So that is what we're setting out for ourselves. That's our agenda. Contextual interpretation, making sure that we interpret the New Testament through its context. Because here is the sore and difficult truth. We are always going to interpret the New Testament through someone's context. And if we are not aware that it's the ancient context that should control the story, we are going to be using our own context. And when we do so, we will frequently misrepresent the New Testament. The land, the history, the culture, those three skills will unlock this treasure in a way that we have never unlocked it before.